everyone, my name is Caitlyn and I run content strategy and diversity programming for the Cloud Foundry Foundation. I want to welcome you to the Cloud Foundry Summit Diversity Conversation. We've changed the name from luncheon because it's closer to afternoon tea in Europe and more like a midnight snack here in California. Regardless of what this event is officially called, it's the nexus of all things diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Cloud Foundry community, and we're really pleased to have you in the audience today. We all know this year has been unlike any other in our lives. In addition to the political upheaval faced by many countries around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended and, in many cases, revealed deep fissures in the known structures of our culture. The line between home and workplace has blurred for billions of people across the globe, and that is largely for the privileged classes who have the option to work remotely. Millions of employees have lost their jobs as their industries functionally disappear during safer-at-home rules, while healthcare and frontline workers, laborers, and those deemed essential continue to put their own lives on the line every time they go to work, with people of color, immigrants, and women disproportionately bearing the burden. Many of us who work in technology have been fortunate enough to keep our jobs and pivot to remote work. But new challenges arise for employees who are responsible not only for themselves, but for children, immunocompromised family members, and elderly relatives. With the collapse of in-person education and the concerns around communal centers for elder care or rehabilitation, the brunt of caretaking falls to the adults who are already pressured to maintain a sense of stability for their families. Because caretaking is so often invisible to those not performing it, it is overlooked and underappreciated. In cultures across the globe, care work is taken for granted by those who are not expected to adopt the role of caretaker. In the United States in particular, the impact of gendered care work expectations has come into the limelight during the pandemic as working mothers are pushed to leave the workforce in droves compared to their male companions. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that 865,000 women left the workforce in the month of September alone, 4 times that of men. Not only are women in heterosexual partnerships more frequently expected to care for the children who are now learning from home, but their jobs are often not compensated at the same rate as their male partners due to the infamous gender pay gap. This leaves parents little choice but to choose the higher-earning partner's job, forcing the co-parent to abandon her career to ensure their children are receiving an education during the pandemic. Here to talk about care work today is Lauren Bacon, a startup co-founder and strategist who began coding in 1996, started her own dev shop in 2000, and works now for And Yet, a software and design consultancy that works with people-first technology organizations. Lauren's writing on business, gender diversity in the tech industry, and well-being at work has been published in Time, Quartz, and The Atlantic. Lauren will explore the crucial impact of care work in our culture and the ways in which it dovetails with care work in the tech industry, and even within writing code itself. In her talk, she will highlight how care work, both personal and professional, goes under the radar and what we can do, especially in the tech industry, but also in our own homes, to make that invisible labor visible. Please join me in welcoming Lauren Bacon to the diversity conversation and giving a special thank you to Steve Greenberg at Resilient Scale for sponsoring this community event. Welcome, Lauren, and thank you, Steve. Enjoy the diversity conversation.
Hi, I'm Lauren Bacon. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am recording this on the traditional territories of the Massachusetts people in the city of Boston, which the Massachusetts call Totonte. It is an interesting thing to be doing a land acknowledgement for a virtual gathering, and it may be an unfamiliar practice to those of you from Europe, I'm not sure. Where I am from, I'm Canadian, I live in the US, is a practice that we engage in to remember our history, to share respect and gratitude to Indigenous peoples, as well as to remember the work that we still have before us to disentangle the complex and messy legacies of colonization. It's a way to ask a series of questions that settlers are rarely forced to ask. Questions like, whose land are we on? And what historical events led to me being here in this moment? Now, the Massachusetts people lived and worked on this land for 17,000 years prior to European contact. But if you were to visit the city and take a Boston history tour, the odds are that you would only hear about colonial history, by which the tour guides mean early colonization and that history in the 1600s. That's the Mayflower and all of that stuff. And then the history that Boston is best known for, which is the events of the American Revolution. You will not hear much about the indigenous people whose land was stolen by these colonists. But that stolen land made all of the rest of that history possible. Now, I'm not suggesting that colonization and what I'm going to talk about today are remotely in the same realm. But one of the recurring themes of this talk has to do with making the invisible visible. The land that I'm on, the geography of the place where I live is invisible to you. And the land that you're on is invisible to me. But without it, we couldn't exist. So land acknowledgement is one practice for making the invisible visible. We look down and we remember that everything we're doing in life, we are doing with the extremely generous support of the earth itself. We look around and we notice that everything we have in life, we have thanks to a very particular set of circumstances, which includes history, genetics, fortune, and so on. So we humans have cognitive limitations and biases that just limit our ability to perceive all of those things at once and regularly. And so I'm very interested in practices that help us to remember. Land acknowledgement is one such practice. But you may have your own practices. And here's a practice I was raised in. I was raised in a household where before every meal, this is very commonplace around the world, we took a moment to express gratitude for everyone and everything that made the meal possible. The farmers, the soil, the air, the water, the sunshine, the people at the grocery store, the family member who cooked. If you have your own practices that help you tap into that feeling of gratitude, of noticing all of the invisible supports that you benefit from, and especially those that you maybe don't think about very often, maybe you could share them in the chat right now as you're listening to this, or send them to me on Twitter. I would love to hear them. Okay, so this talk was sparked by two things. First, headline after headline like these ones, and countless conversations with other parents who have been utterly overwhelmed this year. Those conversations included tears, a lot of tears, fear of losing jobs, exasperation with remote learning, a sense of being stretched to the absolute limit, to the breaking point by the competing demands on their time, energy, and attention. And then also noticing how gender factored into various families' choices about how to cope. And this is the other piece that inspired this talk from the Cloud Foundry website, a collective vision for an ethical, people-first technology community and future. That resonated with me deeply because I'm a parent of two kids, ages 5 and 8. I'm a woman who's worked in tech since 1997, much of that time focused on supporting organizations that were focused on social change and collective thriving. Also, the company I work for now, and yet also describes itself and the projects that we work on as people first. And so I want to talk today about what I think that means in this particular moment, in a very particular context, in tech, in 2020, at this inflection point. So how do we live and work in people-first ways while surviving a pandemic? That's question number one. And what are some of the lessons that we might take out of this incredibly difficult year that might help us to build more people-first tech and a more people-first future? Okay, so like I said earlier, I want to focus here on how we can make the invisible more visible. And that's because in any conversation about diversity and inclusion and putting people first, we are asking questions about whose voices and perspectives are foregrounded and whose are not being seen or prioritized. Often when we look at diversity, we focus on aspects of identity and lived experience, race, gender, sexual orientation, neurodivergence, disability, and so on. But within every group, there will be other facets of diversity to consider that are specific to your context. So my friend Tara Robertson, who until recently led Mozilla's Global Diversity and Inclusion team, has a great slide in one of her talks that I'll link to later that outlines 27 different facets of diversity among Mozillians, including some that don't always get mentioned when we talk about diversity writ large, but that might be familiar to you, like technical versus non-technical, volunteer and employee, time zones, role and level. So I won't go through the whole list here, but I would invite you to reflect on these and other aspects of diversity and how they might show up in the Cloud Foundry community. And then ask yourself these questions, which I also got from Tara: whose voices are centered by default and whose are less visible or prominent? So today I want to focus on 3 axes of diversity: work roles, family status, especially as it relates to care work responsibilities, and gender. And I want to put all of these in the context of both this year's pandemic and the tech sector writ large. I'm deliberately putting gender third here because while I'm going to share some data about men and women, and actually a brief sidebar here, I don't believe that gender is binary. But I'm limited to some extent by the way that social scientists and journalists tend to use binary gender in their research and reporting. So I apologize in advance for that limitation and that simplistic vocabulary, as well as the extremely heterocentric lens that appears almost everywhere on child rearing data. So, okay. That's my sidebar. So as I was saying, I'm going to share some data about men and women and how care work is expected and assigned differently by gender. But I really want us to think beyond whatever our own gender identity is and ask some big questions about how we all value care and maintenance work and how that work benefits us all. So what is care work and why is it so often invisible? Let's start by defining care work, and then we'll talk a little bit about the invisibility piece. This is going to loop back around to pandemic parenting and to the tech context, but I think it's important to first define our terms. So care work is a term that's used in different contexts to mean slightly different things. But here's one definition that has been widely cited. Care work includes everything we do to maintain, contribute, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That work includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environments, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. So those are the words of Berenice Fisher and Joan C. Tronto from an academic article that they co-authored in 1990. Many other feminist scholars, as well as activists who focus on a range of issues, disability justice, anti-racism, queerness, have built a huge body of work around care work and around an ethics of care as essential to community, inclusion, and thriving for all. And that is a whole universe that we could explore if we had all day, but let's start here for now. Now, that definition might sound a little bit heady, so let's bring it right back down to earth. Why do all of these scholars care so much about care work? There are many layers to that question, but a big part of the answer is economics, because care work is very frequently either unpaid or underpaid. And yet, as artist Jenny Odell put it, it's a type of work that makes all other work possible. So, when we talk about care work, we are talking about both the care work that we do as part of our jobs, that's checking in with our colleagues, maintaining relationships and communities, anything involving relationships, empathy, repair, maintenance, support, as well as care work that we do outside of work, which might include tending to our own physical needs, our children, our elders, and other family members, community service and volunteer work, preparing meals, doing the shopping, taking out the recycling, all of that stuff. So It's a huge range of things. We don't usually think of care work as work. And there are reasons for that, broadly economic, that I'll get to momentarily. But first, I want to just take another brief detour into how this typically plays out in the tech sector specifically. So if we bring that definition of care work back up, it includes everything we do to maintain, contribute, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. Okay, so you might notice these words, maintain and repair, these stood out to me very specifically as very familiar words to anybody who's worked in software, right? I think you probably all get this. And how much fun is maintaining a project, fixing bugs? It's not the glamorous part of coding, right? Cleaning up technical debt. This is all largely invisible to most people. But like, does it ever make the whole engine run more smoothly, right? So among your peers, you might get some recognition and appreciation for it, but beyond your inner circles, most people will just kind of go about their lives without ever noticing the ways that you improved it, right? It's core infrastructure work. And that's care work right there in a nutshell. It's the work of maintainers, the work of infrastructures, the countless pesky bug fixes and performance improvements that make everyone else's work easier, make their work possible. But that work is frequently invisible, right? It's hard to draw attention and resources to it. But there's another kind of care work that's also prevalent in tech, and that in my experience has some gendered connotations. I touched on it very briefly. It has to do with the way that even within technical projects, we have certain roles that I call empathy roles, where a significant part of the job involves tuning into what other people want and need and caring about those things, basically. So often these are roles where you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. Say UX work or QA or documentation or even product management, user research. We also see this a lot in community management, training, onboarding new contribs, all of that stuff. So, or really anywhere where some aspect of translation is involved, in a sense of translating between different kinds of people and their different sets of perspectives and needs. So the people who do best in these roles are skillful at being able to see things from multiple perspectives. They have strong empathy and communication skills. Now, all of us have to do some of this work, right? But in my 20 plus years in the tech industry, I cannot count how many times other women, non-binary, and trans people have confided in me that they've felt pressured by managers or peers to move into empathy roles rather than staying in more technical ones. Now, I'll confess that this is somewhat anecdotal data, but I've had many, many conversations about this, and they tell me they've had conversations about this, and I just find it very interesting, especially since in some places, not all, but some places, these roles are not paid as well as more technical ones. Now, that's not to suggest that their managers want them to earn less money, but I can't help wondering whether this might be a factor, again, of gender biases at play and expectations that care work and empathy work in particular is for women. So we certainly see larger concentrations of women in industries that rely on care work, such as hospitality, healthcare, and service work. So it makes sense in a way that we would have expectations that our gender identity would somehow magically grant us, an aptitude for care work. But back to economics, care work is not well paid, and it doesn't carry a lot of prestige either. So there are real costs to these assumptions if we delegate all of the care work to women and trans and non-binary people, right? It doesn't lead to an equitable distribution of work, income, and power, at least not if our current economic reality persists and we continue to equate care work with lower skill. So this is a topic that we could discuss at length, and I know I haven't fashioned an airtight case here, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of drop in that observation and leave it there as a question mark so that we can cover everything that I want to cover today. let's talk for a moment about prestige and status. So you might notice that care work doesn't sound very glamorous. Caring for our bodies, like that's just a thing that we need to do to get through the day, right? 3 square meals, bathing, going to the doctor once in a while. And then even if you put that in the context of paid work, of professions that involve caring for somebody else's body, well, maybe being a doctor sounds prestigious, but being a nurse or a home care worker, those are generally underpaid, low status jobs, right? There's an inverse relationship, interestingly, between the intimacy level of these jobs and how highly we value them. It's the same with educational roles. So higher education teaching is a higher status job than early childhood education. Why? Well, in part because we as a society have decided that it requires more skill to obtain a PhD in an obscure specialty than it does to support the social, emotional, and cognitive development of infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. But is that true? I mean, it's a different skill set, to be sure, and higher ed requires more schooling, but then many of the early childhood educators I've known have master's degrees, and they often start out with thousands of hours of hands-on experience because they've been babysitting and nannying and running camps for kids, essentially apprenticing their way into being incredible experts at caring for and educating young children. I know that personally, as someone who never did any of those things, I've benefited enormously from the expertise of paid caregivers and early childhood educators who just carry around incredible depths of knowledge and understanding of developmental models and diagnostic skills. Now, I'm not saying that there's no logic behind these economic realities, only that if we want to make the invisible visible, if we want to value care work, it's worth digging a little beneath these assumptions and really asking ourselves how we as a society want to value this work and this expertise, rather than simply accepting the current reality as a given. I would also argue that these social norms around care work and prestige factor heavily into our choices around how to prioritize care work, both at home and in the workplace. When we think about what kind of work takes precedence, if we have to choose about who performs which kind of work more often, even in the workplace. This association between care work and lower status has ramifications for how we perceive ourselves within our families and in our workplaces. And so conversely, in families and workplaces where care work is treated as a priority and afforded status and appreciation, that makes a huge difference to how people feel and perform in those environments. Okay, care work in the pandemic. There's that Jenny Odell quote again. So care work makes all other work possible, but it carries with it no prestige and either no pay or low pay. It's essential, and yet we assign it no economic value. So this tension has perhaps never been quite so evident to so many people at the same time as it has this year, when the COVID-19 pandemic set off several care work crises all at once. So here's just a few categories of care work that became far more challenging in 2020. Childcare, elder care, community care, education, maintaining friendships, collaborating with our colleagues got harder, mental health, physical health, substance use, so many issues. And as these things became more challenging, they've also become more visible. And that is maybe the one thing that I will give COVID credit for. As far as silver linings go, there's nowhere for care work to hide right now. Parents in particular have faced a truly overwhelming situation, working from home, caring for children full-time, and managing kids' remote education. It's left every parent I know frayed to the point that we've just kind of resorted to playing like whose turn is it to have a breakdown with one another. But it's not just parents who've been suffering, obviously. So a few specific examples of the challenges that particular groups have been facing. 1.5 billion children were suddenly home 24/7. Schools and daycare centers closed or shifted to remote schooling with varied success. And we had no grandparent backup either due to the increased risks in that age group. COVID-19 infections and deaths swept through senior care facilities at tragic rates, exacerbated in part by underpaid care workers who were working multiple jobs to make ends meet and had to travel between facilities to do so. Women's unemployment rates were and are dramatically higher than men's, due in part to the gendered concentration of jobs in industries that were most affected by COVID, so hospitality, service. Many women who live with men quit their jobs to care for children due to the untenable home situations combined with the higher earning power of their male partners. That's the headline that I cited at the beginning of the talk. Many individuals in higher risk groups, seniors, people with disabilities, immunocompromised people, and so on, have experienced devastating isolation and loneliness. With so many of us shifting suddenly and unexpectedly to remote work and work from home setups, many of us are struggling to maintain a sense of connection and closeness with work colleagues. And to be clear, these challenges will not disappear overnight when a vaccine is found. So on the question of women leaving the workforce, experts are predicting that it will take at least a decade or more for women to recover the progress they had been making in the workforce, and that their career earnings will, in many cases, be decimated by the gap in their resumes. Now, why is it women leaving the workforce in such disproportionate numbers? I mean, part of it, as I sort of referenced earlier, is pure math, right? Like women earn less than men on average. And so for many heterosexual households with kids, if they can only have one adult working for pay, then it just makes sense, at least on paper, for the lower earning partner to drop out and care for the kids. But there are a couple of other factors here as well. First of all, I mean, if more workplaces afforded all employees flexible schedules and part-time options, then families wouldn't be put in a position of having to have one parent out of the workforce. That's something more workplaces need to institute, because it makes an enormous difference to employee retention and well-being and short and long-term career outcomes for women, especially. But there's another thing that needs to be addressed, and this one is something that each of us needs to address in our own lives, wherever it shows up, both at work and at home, which is care work and gender. So you may have noticed that we've been talking a lot about women here, and that's because women are massively overrepresented in both paid and unpaid care work. So if we shift our focus to unpaid care work, by which I mean things like child and elder care, but also household work like cooking, cleaning, laundry, all of those unglamorous things that need to be tended so that we can function as whole, healthy humans. Well, McKinsey research puts it very plainly. Around the world, women do 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. And in case you're thinking, oh, maybe there's a few outlier countries who are really skewing the results there, I've got terrible news, which is that this phenomenon is by no means confined to developing economies. It's a consistent fact that women work a double shift in advanced economies too. In the US, for instance, women do twice as much unpaid care work as men. So that's not great news, but just to drive home that it's also not a matter of families choosing to distribute paid care work and paid, other work equitably between their partners. More terrible news, even among individuals who earn the majority of their household's income. 43% of women who are primary household income earners continue to do all or most of the household work, compared with only 12% of men. So we have gender issues here. And by the way, also from McKinsey, this nice little tidbit, which is that the value, if we actually accounted for unpaid care work in our economies, the value of that unpaid care work by women is $10 trillion, or 13% of global GDP. So this also plays out at work, right? In terms of how we distribute the jobs of social connection and team building and so on. I will never forget a male founder who told me very proudly that he had hired his first woman to work at his previously all-male company. And the very first thing out of his mouth about her was nothing about her role or her qualifications. It was, she's so great. She makes us all break for lunch. We're all talking to each other now and we're eating properly. It's so good. She's like the office mom. There have been so many articles and books written telling women to stop doing this work in the office, telling women how to be taken more seriously and to opt out of these office mom roles. Now, I don't necessarily disagree that we could benefit from that approach, but there is a flip side to that, which is, what if men valued care work enough to prioritize it and take it on themselves? What if that male founder said to himself, you know what? These staff lunches are doing wonders for everyone's well-being and their productivity and sort of general happiness in the company. The company's a better place to work now. Maybe I should put this in somebody's job description and pay them for their time and energy and expertise in coordinating this, right? Or what if he decided to organize a few himself? And if we go back to unpaid care work, the work of maintaining a home, a family, a community outside of work. Again, what if men decided to prioritize that and shoulder their share of it? Now, I know that this is probably the norm in some of your countries, so bear with me. Some of you are probably shaking your heads in Denmark and Iceland and so on, but in most parts of the world, it is not the norm. And there's only so much that women can do to shift that discrepancy without a little help. So this is another topic that we could talk about for hours, but again, I just want to note it. And also note that when we talk about paid care work, we're also talking for the most part about women. So if you choose to pay someone to outsource some of this, right, to clean your house and care for your kids and look after your aging parents, odds are that that person is a woman. And she's probably underpaid. I'm laughing. It's not actually funny, but there's a lot of bad news to deliver and trying to do it with a smile. So we all need to care and be cared for. I want to pause here. So I want to pause here and say, none of this is meant as a guilt trip, okay? If you're doing less care work than you'd like to be, I definitely don't want you leaving this session feeling like you're a terrible person. And if you're someone who really thrives on so-called productive work, right, in the economic sense, and you're in a position to support a partner or hire help with your own care needs, that's great. My goal is not to add a layer of judgment to care work and say that it's more valuable or more important than other forms of work. It's simply to make it more visible and to say, hey, this work matters and it's happening, it's getting done, often with great skill. Let's acknowledge it and how crucial it is to us getting anything else done. So what happens when we make care work more visible? There's layers and layers to this issue, but for today, the main things I want you to ponder are, for yourself, what kinds of care work are you currently performing? And where do you benefit from the care work of others? What kinds of care work do you wish that you could be doing? What kinds of care work do you wish others were doing for you? And how are some external forces like the pandemic, the work from home situation, health, economics, family roles and responsibilities, and other factors, how are those external forces constraining your capacity to give and receive care? Because those things matter too, right? So asking these questions is all part of making the invisible visible. I also invite you to ask in your workplace, how do you value care and maintenance work there? How do you wish that it were valued? And is there a difference between the two? Now, my hope is that through this talk, I will open up a space of inquiry for you to just consider these questions and how we might reimagine our work and our personal lives in ways that make care work more visible, more respected, and more valued. I want to take a very brief moment for those of you who in the room who might have the power to shift workplace policies. I just want to share the key recommendations from this McKinsey report on COVID-19 and gender equality. Their recommendations are for business leaders. I think it goes for, leaders in any sector. Their number one recommendation is simply to make interventions to reduce gender imbalance in responsibility for unpaid care work. And they recommend that leaders act now to make the following interventions. So flexible and part-time work options. That's number one. In all of these, in every report, on everything I've read, flexible and part-time work options, number one. Childcare policies. This one I think is worth noting, rethinking performance reviews and evaluations in light of how the pandemic is affecting households. I think that's so critical this year. A professionalized childcare industry, we don't all have control over that, but for those of you in larger organizations, you may have some ability to influence that. And redistributing the responsibilities for care work. So with any of you who do have the power to make these kinds of changes, I really do hope that you'll take note. As I bring this to a close, I want to revisit the phrase that I put up on the screen at the very beginning about a vision for a people-first technology community and future. People first is how I found my way into technology, and people first is also one of our most fundamental values at And Yet, the company where I work. Building a people-first project of any kind demands empathy. It demands care, right? And Yet's CEO, Sarah Avenir, uses gardening metaphors a lot to talk about business and leadership and team building and community, and even technology. Gardening is inherently care work, right? It's maintenance, it's repair, it's tending to the weeds, it's nourishing the roots. Gardeners are care workers and productive workers. They're planting, growing, and harvesting. They're feeding everyone. Now, that might not be a metaphor that's commonplace in tech organizations. Gardening does not scale 10x. It does not produce hockey stick growth or any of those other metaphors that are prevalent in our industry. But a garden is a place where many beings can thrive. And where giving and receiving care is all part of the cycle, where things bear fruit, where sustainability is key, and where a little bit of maintenance makes all the difference. I've probably worn this metaphor into the ground, but I will say this much. We all need space and time for productive work and for care work. This is not an either or, it's a both and. We can all pitch in the People First Technology Garden. We can contribute our own care work. We can appreciate and make visible the care work of others. We can look for ways to support our colleagues who are at higher risk of having their care responsibilities overwhelm their capacity for paid work. We can help more at home, or we can help less if that's an option. We can look for ways to compensate paid care workers better and to afford them more prestige and respect. We can notice who is being tapped for empathy roles on our projects and what opportunities those roles afford in the long term. We can pay attention to whose voices are included and whose aren't even in the room. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm imagining that at least some of you are watching this while performing care work of some kind, and that thought brings me a lot of joy. So if you're doing care work in any capacity, whether it's right in this moment or in general, I hope that if you take away just one thing, it's this: I see you, we see you, and your work matters so much. I hope that I've given you some vocabulary with which to consider and talk about care work and to make it more visible and valued for yourself, for your family, your community, and your workplace. Thank you so much.